Hey, welcome back to Invisible Machines, a podcast produced in partnership with UX Magazine and OneReach.ai. This podcast was born out of a book called Age of Invisible Machines that I co-authored along with my co-host here, Rob Wilson. Rob is the founder and CEO of OneReach.ai and has been working with conversational AI for decades. And so it was kind of funny. As we wrote the book, the irony wasn't lost on us that we were about to publish information about technology that is moving so quickly. And indeed, our book came out, I think, a few months before OpenAI released ChatGPT and blew the world's collective minds. So the core information in the book really doesn't change, but now we have this opportunity with the second edition coming out to revisit some of those ideas and add in some information about generative AI. And the exercise is kind of pointing us in the direction of a question that we're going to wrestle with a bit today. Will we still need books moving forward? Are books still a viable way to collect and present information in an era when people can just talk to machines, when you can feed a chat window a prompt, and seconds later get 50,000 words out the other side? Will we still need books as artifacts, as vehicles, as things to put on our coffee table, as things to put on shelves, as things to dive into on a rainy afternoon? We want to know. And so we turned to Lou Rosenfeld, who is a legend in the realm of experience design. Lou is an information architect from way back in the day. He is also the founder of Rosenfeld Media, which has published many books about all aspects of experience design from many of the cutting-edge practitioners out in the world. It was great getting to talk to Lou. We also delve into moment prisons, a concept that he came up with. I think he published an article called Moment Prisons and How to Escape Them a number of years ago. And the idea is, in the case of an information architect, maybe you have a small group of IAs who identify as such and who are banding together to pound the table and get attention paid to the things that they think are really important about technology. And then as more people start to join the fray and technology changes, the perception of what an information architect starts to shift. And then the moment prison thing kicks in. Like, do we hold on to this title because it gives us identity and unity? Or do we need to start thinking about ways to diversify our thinking around information architecture? That's kind of an important question. And so we asked that one too, because, right now, obviously technology is zooming all around us, and getting stuck in a moment prison could be kind of a dangerous thing. So I don't know, Lou, what do you think? How do we get out of moment prisons? And will people still turn to books and authors in their time of need for both information and, I suppose, entertainment? Let's get into this conversation right now and see what Lou has to say. All right, Lou, well, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. Elias, our producer who you just met, he and I were having a discussion earlier. He had sent some additional notes over for me to look at, and he said, I'll let you go dig into that Lou read right now. And it was a nice little moment where there was some congruity between you and Lou Reed, I think. And so I decided...
Another nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn.
There it is. There it is. And you're wearing a black T-shirt. I think Lou would approve of that. And so I was listening to the song Perfect Day while I was reading his notes. He put together some more notes about moment prisons, which also just came up pre-recording here. And I guess I was kind of wondering, like, I'm sure there's just moment prisons galore popping up right now. And I thought maybe we could talk about some of the most egregious ones. And then, are we in a moment too where moment prisons are especially dangerous? And then third, is the song Perfect Day actually about moment prisons? Because he's just talking about a perfect day. And is he trying to hold on too tightly, or is he letting go?
Oh, probably.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we could jump. Wow, we're jumping right into moment.
Yeah, let's
just
dive in.
Well,
first.
All right. So I'm an old fart, right? I've been in UX or equivalent thereof for 30 years, 35 years, whatever it's been, and I've been as guilty as anyone of just being kind of sucked into identity, like I am an information architect, and that makes it really, like, it's really important that we information architects all get together and be together and support each other. It's new and scary and nobody really gets us. And that is how a term like information architecture really takes off, because it gives people not only some tools, but an identity when they're not understood.
Medicine for our imposter syndrome.
Oh, well put, well put. And that imposter syndrome is true in a lot of places, right? I mean, the content strategist, I just was at Confab recently, the content strategy conference that Christina Halverson and Brain Traffic put on. And here it's 2023, and I felt like it could have been an information architecture conference from 1999. It's a great conference, don't get me wrong, I love it. And I love the people, but there's this sense of being misunderstood and needing to rally around a term and an identity. And then I was at Mind the Product in May, another great conference. And here it's, all the designers think the product managers have all the power. And they're misunderstood. And they're feeling like, they need that identity. So, everyone feels misunderstood. Everyone needs community, and then they have success. And then they start doubling down on that identity when it's no longer all that useful. So I certainly saw that in the information architecture world. I've seen it in pretty much every, I hate to use this term tribe, but it is kind of tribal, how so many of us go, oh, thank goodness, I get it. I'm being gotten because we've come under this term, whatever it is. I mean, there are so many out there. Maybe right now another term might be product designer. Oh, thank God I'm a product designer. Now I'm real. But what about next year? Well, product design is blah, 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 blah. No, I think product design is blah, 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 blah. And so then you start seeing that kind of bickering that starts to snowball. So in the UX world, we saw the IA kind of, we're all split into what was called big IA, little IA. And big IA was really kind of what split off into the interaction design community. And little IA was people looking at search and taxonomy and navigation and things like that. And you know what? I mean, if we tried to hold on to each other too long, and it became bitter. Because we were all fighting for a definition of something that its moment had passed. And that's a moment prison. It starts off as a positive, and then because we hold on to it too tightly for many emotional reasons, it becomes a negative. It becomes counterproductive. And it's not just the names of practices or roles. It's also metaphors. Minimum viable product. Portal. You name it. These things become damaging if we're not careful. And I mean, just to pick on Portal, you guys are probably old enough to remember it. I don't know about the listeners, but I used to go and do consulting with large organizations who would tell me, I'm the consultant, but they're telling me what they need, and that's a portal. And I'd say, well, what's a portal? Sputter, sputter, sputter. And then what I would do is I'd say, listen, we're going to have a conversation in the next day or two while I'm with you, and we're going to ban that word. And if anyone uses that word, throw $1 on the table. If I use it, throw $10 on the table. And it's interesting how productive the conversation would be when you would ban a moment prison. Like imagine banning the word agile from certain conversations.
Sometimes I'd love to do that.
Productive? Don't you? Because these moment prisons become masks for a problem that's still undefined and not diagnosed. And
they're sort of victims of they're victims of their own success. I sort of see it as a low fidelity, high fidelity. We see these terms that get grabbed onto because they're very low fidelity, and by that I sort of think of it like in the McLuhan is term, which is you get to shape them, right? Like anyone that hears them gets to shape them. They're not specific, they're so low fidelity that they can be to the listener whatever they want to make it. And so all of a sudden that like increases its popularity and people grab onto it because 10 different people hear it and then formulate their own meaning to serve their own purposes, right? And they're like, that's perfect. I'll recreate, I'll define this to suit myself. And so it takes off as a concept. And then all of a sudden we have, naturally what comes next with low fidelity ideas, everybody wants to define them and create fidelity. They're like, wait, what are we, what does this mean? We're using a word, but it means different things to different people. So now we need to officially define it. So then we go about arguing about what the definition is, turning a low fidelity term into a high fidelity term. And as your point, now we've created a moment. Now we've defined it and it's static in time. And now all those people that defended it have to like maintain it, even though its meaning now is changing. They have to now defend this because they argued so hard for this high fidelity term. And we go, well, low fidelity terms have value. They're great at organizing people. They're great at creating movements. But then to your point, they get in their own way, which is interesting. So now we have like prompt engineering and AI and
beware the term that has its oown conference, right? Like
we have so many of those terms in AI, AI itself, anthropomorphism, like, oh God, we got a lot of moment prisons coming. A lot of people arguing about definition of low fidelity terms.
Well, I love the way you put it in the framing around fidelity, but I think we're human beings and we try to make sense of things. It's a complicated world. There's more and more change all the time. And so when we have that moment of clarity, it's almost addictive. And listen, I'm very much associated with information architecture, and I'm very happy about that. I'm really glad to have been part of the growth of IA. I remember at some point in the late 90s taking a trip to San Francisco, not long after the Polar Bear book had come out. And I forget what company I visited, maybe it was HP, somewhere like that. And some designer met me and she like just dropped everything, came over to me and hugged me. And she says, thank you. Thank you. Now I know what it is I do, and you've made things so much easier for me. I've had that kind of thing happen. And so for me, it's like, wow, I really love being associated with that. That's a really good feeling, but I've had to let it go. I've had to let it go because I think for the reasons we've been talking about, you have to be able to walk away to the next thing. You have to be able to acknowledge that we are living in moments in time, and the moment of the moment, this moment is one thing, the next moment is another. They may come days, weeks, months, years apart, but you have to be able to move between them. You have no choice. And I think it's getting harder and harder to do this, but we have to do it.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time on this.
You AI people.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about sort of the fear of failure becoming a major stumbling block, not just to organizations that are trying to work with AI, but also individuals. And this feels tied to that, right? Like there's something about couching yourself, a safety net of like, well, I'm an information architect. I can always be an information architect. There will always be a need for information architecture, which is true to a point. But as more and more things start converging, then you do yourself more of a service by blending, moving out into other pools of thought and of action.
Yeah, or I can always be an information architect as long as we don't define it too specifically.
I mean, I used to, I found it was very liberating once I'd been doing IA for about 15 years to stop using that term. I mean, I didn't ban it necessarily, but it just like, I stopped thinking about IA as a solution, and I started going back to thinking about problems that I could help solve using things like IA and other things as well. And that's how a practice like IA or any other would remain fresh. So imagine, the standard 1999 definition of IA doesn't really address AI.
Yeah.
And if you're practicing IA today and you're not thinking about AI,
Right.
kind of a problem, and your practice is pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a good moment to go back and remember that initial moment, as there was a need for a movement, a term. We wanted people to care about the user interface. We wanted to take it more seriously, design of these interfaces. I think it's never seen the importance, at least the emphasis that should be put on it fully realized. I think we keep giving so much credit to technology as a whole, and so little to the front end. Just knowing ChatGPT took off because of the chat interface, not the back end was there the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just funny how we overemphasize the front end in some respects, and then forget about it in others, and get it all mixed up. And now we have conversation as an interface, just to make it that much more confusing, and to make designing that much more complex, and just to shake the ground underneath anyone who thought they finally could label themselves and define what they do. Now that schools are teaching it, and they're like, okay, I've been made legitimate, and now we're going to shake it all up again, because information architecture is about high bandwidth communication of knowledge, or of data, and now we talk about conversation, which isn't the highest bandwidth way to communicate lots of data. And so now we're going to mix the two. Now we're going to have conversations mixed with graphical elements and graphical user interfaces, going back and forth, which just, means visual designers working with, potentially linguists or people who care about language, and having to work in an intertwined way, where it's the sort of, a dance now. It's like a tango they have to do together,
Well, Rob, I love the way you put this, that language is, you're framing it in terms of bandwidth or density. And my immediate reaction to that when you were saying that is, no, language is really quite dense, because it has like unbelievable semantic nuance, but it also has context. Language is very dependent on context, as well as it creates context. But then, in the context, if you're thinking about it in terms of AI and the sort of disintermediated interfaces and so forth that we're all working on and working with increasingly, it's often very context-less. Isn't that always the problem in AI, that the context or the domain is hard to fold into whatever problem you're addressing? AI doesn't necessarily know that I'm sitting in my kitchen in Brooklyn or in your office in Denver, and what that means, who you're with and who you are. So interesting point, like about density and bandwidth. And I like to think that IA is a means for introducing context to those settings.
Yeah. That's a good way to actually frame it, to say, a conversation with context is so much more useful than trying to glean context purely from the conversation and the words itself. And I've said it a number of times, the next big breakthrough on understanding isn't going to come from understanding the words better. LLMs doing better predictability is going to come from better context. Without context, there's only so far any system can go in terms of understanding, because as humans, our prediction machines rely so much on context.
Right.
And yeah, what is information architecture in a world where you're not necessarily visualizing or directly communicating to the end user, but you're actually communicating data to the LLM or the AI agent, so that it can effectively communicate to the end user? And what does information architecture to an LLM look like differently from a human, in the sense that we don't need all these graphical, sweeteners and visual cues. We don't have a left to right, kind of idea with eye movement and fonts. Now we're saying, what is the right context to give the LLM so that it can deliver, a good response or effective generation of text, and how much is too much and how much is too little. And it's just it's different, but then it's the same.
Well, I also think it's not like this idea of context is not a binary, right? It's not it's not that you either have it or you don't. I mean, we already see this in IA, really in information in general, that there is a spectrum of semantic value. So like we see, for example, data has very little semantic value, but tables of data have more. Text has semantic value, but structured text has far more, and conversation has even much more. And then when you fold in things like metadata, there's lots of varieties of metadata: uncontrolled, controlled semantic versus not. There's a whole bunch of spectra. And then you could take that even further. I attended a talk a couple weeks ago. We actually hosted it by Dane DeSuter and Stephanie Skopilaitis on gesture interpretation. Where, I mean, that's a kind of interesting context or context aid that can be brought in, where they're talking about how to read what you're doing right now, Rob, with your chin, or Josh for the tilt of your head, or what I might be doing with my eyebrows, our hand gestures, broader body language. Those are things that can certainly add a lot of contextual or even potentially semantic meaning that AI is probably going to be able to work with if it's not already.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about all the unstructured data too that opens up with LLMs, being able to parse that as well. Yeah, we had a conversation with Dr. Jim Weber from Neo4j. He's the chief scientist there, and kind of it sort of dawned on us in that conversation that LLMs and something like GraphDB are just almost made for each other in that sense, in terms of providing context and treating data more on a relationship basis than putting it in static spots.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking, I can't, it's still sort of infant thought in terms of what our information architecture is to an LLM. We always think its goal is to communicate not just data, but in the context of helping humans make better decisions. I mean, usually that's ultimately the net result. It's not to just communicate the data for the sake of communicating the data. It's really to facilitate a human making a better decision and a more data-driven decision. And that's like a noble effort. But now we're talking about helping LLMs make data-driven decisions and better decisions on what to say, and understanding that they think differently, so to speak. And so now we're, empathy, right? It's like this weird empathy challenge of, okay, pretend you're an LLM. Now, how would you best consume this information? An example of this is recently I've been doing some testing, realizing that when I'm trying to communicate, pattern-based data like tables to an LLM so that it can, use that as context, right, to answer questions or whatever, that if I use Markdown to communicate the data elements versus just commas, right, and paragraphs, it works substantially better at understanding what data is associated with what labels, and then does a much better job at, in natural language, communicating. And I'm like, okay, that's not that different from people, right? Because we we'd rather see it in a table than a paragraph. So that's like, okay, that's a given. We can assume that. But I think most people would be surprised that it's also true for LLMs that they'd rather see it in a table formatted than actually in a paragraph, comma delimited, which is interesting. Where these differences are, we'll discover over time, but how this affects this indirect information architecture of telling an LLM what it needs to know to make better decisions on what to say to humans is just like, it's definitely turns it more into an art than it was already.
Or if it's not an art, it is. There's a lot more intuition than a lot of scientists might want to admit. But what you're making me think of is like this. I never really thought of it this way, but this fundamental crossroads in everything that's happened in technology in the last 25 years or 30 years really came when the web took off. I'm going to probably get my history wrong, but my understanding is HTML is a very easy to use, oversimplified, depending on how you see it, subset of SGML, Structured Generalized Markup Language. And, SGML was around for a few years, and Tim Berners-Lee, created HTML and pissed off a lot of the SGML people because he kind of, not only did he simplify it, which was great, that's why we could start creating web pages very quickly, and we did, but he also started munging together presentation and logic. And so the semantics of, emphasis versus italic, right? That kind of level of simplification was good for jump-starting the web, but bad for us today. Right? Like, it kind of screwed a lot of IA work up badly because we have to then go back and try to reintroduce the logic or the structure back into all this information we've been creating, sort of post hoc. But we also have to we have to get AI to do the same thing. I mean, AI is depending on the structure to be there,
right?
Or it has to figure it out. It's a lot of work. So Tim Berners-Lee giveth and Tim Berners-Lee taketh away years later.
Yeah. I can't help but wonder, and I'm curious what you think about this. Again, like moment prison prompt engineering, right? Like, okay, we can already predict that to be on your list of things that we locked in time and defined too early, but is it coding or is it information architecture? Because coding's so deterministic, right? And information architecture is this like directing somebody towards a conclusion in a sense, or at least giving them data so they can come to their own conclusions. So it's
on the spectrum,
right?
It's on the spectrum. I mean, coding and IA are, IA is coding of a form. It's just, it marches maybe a little higher up to the non-deterministic information, right? It accounts for more than data. It does actually work better, or is designed to work better with to create more structured information, and that has value. I just don't know if it's an either or.
Right.
We've had a number of conversations about how natural language, might kind of usurp a lot of coding languages once more machines can just speak in natural human language to one another. How does that kind of mess with this idea of like how we organize language, how we organize data? How do you see that factoring in?
Well, at a certain level, there has to be some definition of the space, of the domain, in this case, of creating code through natural language, right? Like there has to be an ontology of here are the tools, here are the objects. To me, that's basically an IA exercise. So at a fundamental level, the domain has to be sort of mapped out for that work to happen. You have to say to, whoever's creating that code, that who's ever, designing the AI there, that they're doing it, but there are certain objects, there are certain relationships, there are certain protocols and certain processes, and they have to be named somehow so that they can be worked with. But maybe your point is more at less on the input level, more on the output level, right? Like, what is the outcome of that look like? Does the way let me ask you to maybe re-ask that question.
You're talking about things that I hadn't even thought about, like that how much intent is kind of built into certain aspects of coding language, and you can't just like scrub that away just because like the emphasis thing means like EM means something in one context. You don't want to lose that bit of knowledge in another context, right? So even though it can speak natural language, it needs to almost have coding language knowledge in a sense, right? Like it needs to understand why certain things exist and what certain markups mean and things like that, which maybe it already does.
It's
to
it's almost like it's like we're sort of ping-ponging back and forth between trying to create code that is based on not just natural language, but the natural world. And then going back in the other direction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's all translation, but like the nature of that translation is changing quite a bit. And maybe, if you were going to start a programming language from scratch today, could it just totally be natural language? Would there be a need for any code under the hood? I don't know. I don't know enough about programming.
Yeah, I go to no, because it's not like many programmers haven't attempted to come up with a coding language that was natural language. And when you get to why we don't have that, it's because of the specificity necessary. Our language isn't specific enough and detailed enough. And so, what would end up happening is just like the English language is not static, So we could, of course, extend it. And that's probably what will happen is if we start to extend language to include terms that are more specific when talking to machines so that we can create that specificity in natural language. So in a way, you have like this pigeon language of code and English starting to merge together into one language so that we can talk to machines in more specific ways. Because otherwise the machine's going to have to disambiguate continuously as you're trying to get something done. And that's annoying. At some point, you're like, all right, screw this. That's not efficient. You're asking me a million questions.
I'm sorry to interrupt, though. I mean, like, maybe this is another situation where you have to pay attention more to context, right? Like, so could a natural language approach to coding be much more effective if it was designed for a specific domain, like mapping out an office layout?
Yes.
Versus designing a new protein.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the challenge you have there is that at some point it's going to have to boil down into something that's readably specific, right? And could it understand and properly predict what you meant with context? I totally think that's coming. And we'll have ephemeral applications that just construct themselves and deconstruct just for one-time use. The code never goes into a repository, it runs, it executes, it's gone. So I do think that is coming, but it still has to manifest in some specific language for the machine to know exactly what you want it to do. Even if that's an interpretive layer, that's that context has to sit in the middle, and then that confirmation, is this what you meant? Now you have to be able to read it as the originator of it to confirm that it got it right. And so now you're going to have to understand the code enough to second guess it. Otherwise, you're trusting the machine far too much. We lose the whole testing, deploying, and all of that stuff. So it's a really good question. Can we go far? Yeah. Can we speed things up? Yeah. Are we going to have a new language that emerges? I think it's going to be this combination of coding and UI components, because graphs still matter, bar charts still matter, and are still great ways to communicate quickly. So we're going to have this interplay of graphical elements and specific code-like language, and we're going to talk to machines in this, this way that doesn't, isn't that far from how, two teenagers talk to each other now with acronyms that we don't even understand. I don't understand half the time to get efficiency. But yeah, I think we're going to just watch an evolution of the English language, or the languages in general, not just English, of course, in a radical way, where the grammar police are just going to lose their minds.
Well, I mean, we already have been using metaphors from computing to talk about the mind for decades, right? My memory processing isn't very good. Actually, there's better examples of that. But and I think the language is going to just completely change, and as it should. That's what it's there for.
Right.
It's supposed to change, right? What I like my main job is a publisher of books and a producer of conferences. And for the former, I'm really interested in how AI might impact the kind of collaboration and iteration that I think producing a book, especially a book, really requires. We try to do things a little differently than a lot of publishers in terms of taking an unusually high level of collaborative and iterative tools and resources and editorial support to work with our authors. I always say, if you are the kind of person who wants to just go sit in your garret for a year and write a book and then come back and present us with a manuscript, you should find a different publisher, because we don't know that manuscript. We haven't worked with you on that manuscript. Now I'm starting to wonder, maybe you're the kind of person who wants to be in that garret, not because you don't want to collaborate and iterate, but because you don't want to do so with humans. And maybe that personal assistant that's AI-based can really help you a lot, and that other AI-based tool that summarizes your ideas and spits out crappy straw men, still pretty useful. And then you could say, no, that's not what I meant. Let me rewrite that. I mean, I had this experience recently where we do all these conferences, and each conference has to be promoted with endless emails. And I've been doing this for dozens of these. And I had to write yet another, 4-line paragraph introducing Conference X. And I was just, I'm just going to ask ChatGPT to do it for me. Because it's just throwaway copy. No one's really going to read it too closely. It's only going to get used once. And I had to generate a couple of versions. And I picked one and I rewrote it. And it probably was 5 minutes, 10 minutes rather than 45 minutes. That was useful. I wonder if we can step that up a bit on the book writing. I don't want a book written by a tool.
No.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I haven't published any yet. But I do think there is a lot of power there.
Yeah.
In terms of helping authors.
We had a conversation with Charlene Lee, who's a best-selling author, and I had been thinking about this too, as someone who's been writing for 25 years. what if I just had an LLM that I fed it everything I've ever written, all the podcasts I've recorded, and I think she's actually maybe in the process of doing something similar now, but her thought was that it's like a second brain. Like if someone asked me a question about, a business's relationship to failure in the hospital setting, like I haven't specifically written about those two things, but if I've trained this LLM well, I can ask it what I might say, and then I can vet that response. And then I feel like if you pull at that thread long enough, even the idea of a book becomes interesting because, especially writing books about technology, right? Like we're working on the second edition of our book, and we're having too much of a field day because we wrote our book before ChatGPT changed everything. So now we're like, how do we go back and take opportunities to do this? And but if a book is the book the right thing going forward? Like if an author has a trained LLM, do they write a new book that is a static thing, or do they have a subscription that they can offer people? You can ask me questions, and I will, with my AI, I will.
One of the things I can't help but think about is that let's just use book. It doesn't matter whatever you've written. Let's just use a book. How many, if we could count, how many conversations had to happen for that book to be written? How many, like, 375 pages, whatever it is, how many conversations had to take place? Is there a book that was worth reading that no conversations happened? Like zero. It required no conversation whatsoever for that book to be written. And isn't just a book a synthesis of all of those conversations? It's not the birth of the idea. The birth of the idea was in the conversations that happened before it. The book is just the synthesis of what it is. And whether an LLM sums up those conversations or not, we can't have a synthesis of conversations that didn't happen.
That is so beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I I'm always telling our authors, like, listen, you have to have some expertise, but it's as important that you're able to facilitate a conversation over time with many people in different ways, whether they are quoted or do sidebars in the book or gave you feedback via a survey or whatever it might be. And I mean, that's not only valuable in terms of content development, you have to do that, especially in a news space. We're not talking about fiction, obviously, but you also, it's like you get stakeholders in your work that way. And I always think that, the books that succeed are the ones where the author and the publisher collaborated on building engagement and getting stakeholders while the book was being written, so that when it comes out, it's got a lot of wind up behind its sails. But I think so like AI in that context can still be a really good tool for a couple things. One is helping generate the crappy manuscript, because that's like, the big hurdle, as you got to get the manuscript done. And if you can, anything to get you to that milestone as an author is huge. The other thing is managing those conversations over time, right? So one of the big problems, I think, in writing is it's a double-edged sword. It's a gift in that you don't often get an opportunity to go so deeply into an idea you care about with hopefully a decent amount of support, but more importantly, a lot of time, whether you're taking a year or whatever. That's unusual these days. But the negative is that you lose track because you probably have a day job and you have a life and you're trying to bite off this huge idea over time and let it germinate and develop over time, and it becomes an information management nightmare. I remember working on a book where I spent months working on one chapter, the hardest chapter. And I was such an idiot because I finally wrote it. And then a month or so later, I realized that I had written it already a year earlier. And I'm an IA guy, right? I'm supposed to know how to manage information. But it's stuff like that I think AI is going to help with. I mean, there are a lot of new tools like, Scrivener is a pretty good tool to help authors in that context. And I think we are just kind of just scratching the surface there in terms of organizing really great ideas. I just want to say one more thing about books, though. Will we still need books? Yeah, I mean, like, I'm already thinking about, like, can we have an LLM made up of our books? And by extension, all the smart things our authors have come up with. That said, there is always, I think, going to be value in a book as an object because it's got boundaries.
Yeah.
We don't always want access to the web of all knowledge and all of its distractions and rabbit holes. I do think there is something to be said for a linear, contained experience of acquiring knowledge or being introduced to ideas.
Yeah,
I don't think it's going away.
Yeah, I think reference books aside, this is storytelling, and storytelling means linear. And we've done this. We've loaded specific books into LLM, trained it to see what happened. And of course, it's as you would imagine. You put it in front of somebody, and they're like, "I don't know what to ask. I don't even know what it's about. I don't even know the boundaries of what to ask. Tell me a good idea." Inspire me. What do you say? It's useless because you're sitting by the campfire and you're like, tell me a story, and they're like, okay, ask me a question. What? Tell me a story, and what is that story
Context.
about? Yeah,
Context.
That story is about the synthesis of many conversations and experiences that's been curated. So I love specific use cases. When we talk generals, I think people tend to get lost, but when we talk specifically, if I was an author writing a biography, I would interview the person and have countless tapes of conversations with that person, right? And it wouldn't be a one-way. Like the questions I would ask, I would elicit certain things. I would try to find the story, find the interest. Then I would have like hours and hours and hours of conversations, right? Knowing that the conversations I had were also built on conversations with other people about this person and what they thought was interesting. And then I have to curate this down into what I think matters, shorten it, and then make it linear and build it into a story. And yes, finally, at the very end, I got to put it on paper into a book for a public, like whatever, that is to focus as that being like the key to writing a book, the moment where you synthesized all the data, what matters, you've had all the conversations, and now you just have to write it down. And we think that's going to replace book writing, like that is not writing a book, just removing the conversations. Those didn't happen. LLMs aren't going to do that. They're not going to synthesize the stories that are most interesting in a way that's highly compelling, and then writing, putting it all together in a way that's understandable.
Synthesis is really hard and underappreciated. But I mean, to your point about conversation, and I totally agree. I mean, I'm always telling our authors, at least, that a book is a polished snapshot of an ongoing conversation that you're going to facilitate. But what behind conversation lies relationships, right? So who do you have a conversation with? Where do you find them? That's really, really hard. So I was playing with ChatGPT a few months ago when I was actually working on programming one of our conferences. I figured, what the hell, I'm interested in knowing who out there knows about knowledge management as a field. And that's something I used to spend a lot of time with, but haven't in decades. And so I asked, like, who's an expert in knowledge management? And it gave me some interesting ideas. It also spit out a few things that were real head scratchers. Like, you know who ChatGPT says is one of the foremost experts in knowledge management? Mike Dukakis. Mike Dukakis. Okay, I don't think that's true. It doesn't mention that he was a presidential candidate in the bio it pulled together for him. It did mention he'd been governor of Massachusetts. For those of you who don't know who Mike Dukakis is, he was the Democratic candidate for president in 92. right?
I think, wasn't he kind of sunk too by like a viral photo of him in a tank with a...
In a tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a little guy in a big tank.
Yeah,
and and Willie Horton being released from prison. And he lost the election to George Bush in, it was 80, now I'm really embarrassed because I thought I was smart about this stuff. But Mike Dukakis is not an expert in knowledge management. He happened to be on a board of an organization that had knowledge in its title. It proved itself to me pretty quickly to be a pretty crappy way to forge relationships that I didn't have yet. I'd be much better off talking to people who knew a little bit about knowledge management. It didn't really help me there. It's not going to be, maybe my point is it's not necessarily going to be a good relationship engine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, you don't have the conversations. You have to do it yourself.
When you think about books too, I think there's sort of this romantic notion, probably more with fiction writing, of the author kind of like punishing themselves in a room to put out their work.
Garrett.
Yeah, exactly. But the process that you describe with your books, and it certainly holds true with the process of writing the book with Rob, is it was like so many conversations and so much talking through ideas and what's going to make it in and what's not going to make it in. And so a book really is important because it's an abstract representation of a level of agreement and passion and interest. Like it's not just this thing that sits on a table. Like not that everyone needs to know all that going into a book, but I think that combined with, we were talking about storytelling, I feel like it becomes clear every day to me that we have almost this biological obsession with story, because we even just retell the same stories, with different masks on the characters over and over again. So I don't think that'll go away, and I think that's a good thing, and I think it's cool to think about like the weight of a book.
Well, literally, yeah. The weight, the dimension, the size. I mean, the other thing that we tend to forget about with products like books is that there's a forcing function of how long you can actually spend on it, both as a writer as well as a reader, and how long, by extension, is the book. So one of the things I'm always doing with people writing book proposals is I say, try this exercise where you have a budget. You're going to write 250 pages because people don't really want to read 500 pages or whatever it is. What are you going to budget that those your 250 pages in terms of your ideas, in terms of the conversations you're having, in terms of the narrative arc? How is that going to play out? It is literally a budget. So, if you are just, screwing around on the web, there's no forcing function. A book has that forcing function built in, partly for economic or business reasons.
Yeah, I almost think of like conversations as like dances. Someone leads, someone follows. It can switch, throughout the conversation. And that's kind of ultimately where we ended up with when we had ingested these books and then put people in front of it and watched them just sit there with a blank look on their face. Like, what's the meaning of life? Like, it has nothing to do with anything on any pages that we had written. We realized that it needed to start a conversation that was in context. It needed to start asking about, how much do you know about AI? How interested in this subject are you? And then it had to kind of guide and lead through the conversation. We had to lead the LLM to lead them through a conversation. And that can get interesting from now the content's being somewhat tailored to the audience. And so where books are kind of one size fits all, you have this opportunity now to kind of create a more hyper-personalized storytelling experience. It's still going to be in buckets. Like, you're still going to have to, create some level of personas and things like that, because as the storyteller, you can't imagine an unlimited audience of individuals, but you could craft it for certain archetypes and have them lead them down that road. You're a 13-year-old. Okay, now I'm gonna lead you through this story, but it's still all doing the same thing in my mind. It's still synthesizing all the conversations that led up to writing that book It's just now synthesizing it in real time instead of us synthesizing it all. And maybe we write the book for the LLM now. We say, okay, we don't need to, worry about all the fluff. We just tell you this sequence of events, the things we thought were important. And maybe there's like a new kind of book that's formatted, almost vectorized, just for an LLM to say, I wrote this book for an LLM. And so it's formatted and the ideas are compartmentalized in such a way that it can be easy, like Lego blocks, easily, built and configured for different readers. Sort of an interesting thought.
You should actually interview Fred Zimmerman of Nimble Books, because I've known him for a zillion years, and back in Ann Arbor, we were both in Ann Arbor years ago, and he has for years been publishing AI written books. He's just different topics. We're not in the same space, but it's interesting what he's doing. That said, we were talking about audience a moment ago, and I do think AI tools can certainly help contextualize content for an audience by doing things like, hey, I want this to be written at a 6th grade level. Okay, I can see that. What I'm not so sure about is what it would do with the directive that I often give authors, which is make the reader the hero. Can AI do that? What do you guys think?
Hit and miss, just like us. I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's all about believability. Again, we have a capacity as humans to make ourselves the hero. It's more up to the reader and their imagination and confidence to be the hero in a lot of cases.
I think there are patterns in storytelling, though.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Make it low fidelity enough, and they'll make themselves the hero. Too high fidelity, and they won't.
When possible. There's a few tricks, like you're saying, Josh. But I mean, it's an interesting dance, because with any kind of book, or really any communication at all, there's the nature of the content, and does it lend itself to a certain voice and tone. There's the voice tone that will engage the readers best, and the readers are diverse. And then there is the voice and tone that fits the personality of the author and the conversations that they facilitate. It's interesting. It's very interesting, and it just makes you realize in so many ways, there are so many things that have to go right for a book to succeed.
Yeah.
There's Robb was actually raised under the tutelage of Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher, and we have this quote that we bounce around a lot. Oh, sorry.
I wouldn't say under the tutelage. I was 11 when he died, but I did play in his yard, and my mom meditated with his wife.
So better than tutelage.
That counts.
Yeah. But we have this quote. I think I'm getting it right, Robb. That he said that basically, with any book, 80% of the material needs to be familiar material. You can only have about like 20% of new information.
That was random. Yeah, that was McGraw-Hill. When they published textbooks. Yeah. He didn't obviously
right
follow that. Yeah.
But I was just wondering if that, I mean, I guess, does that hold up when we're talking about books that are specifically about like how to do specific things working with technology? Maybe that shifts. But also now we have this idea that we've been talking about. Maybe you have a personalized, like maybe you could say, I just want the 20% of this book that's new. Can you give me that? Because I think I'm pretty well versed on the 80%. Like there could be that level of personalization as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Certainly for things that are highly technical. I mean, if like for what we do, which is not really technical, I don't know that would work. Most of the change in our books comes from not only experience that authors have that other people just don't have. It's not new, but it may be new to a specific reader, but it's also the synthesis.
Yeah, exactly.
UX is all about synthesis of different practices and methods and tools from all kinds of different areas. And when you put things together in new ways, you do get new things. It's still putting together stuff that exists already. Yeah.
Yeah, when you think of
that's an
those
interesting point, though.
specifics, like to go back to McLuhan, his book "Media is the Massage," right? It was a misspelling. But then he was like, well, it's an interesting misspelling because mass age and his global village, and he's like, I think I'll stick with it. I'm gonna stick with that misspelling.
Right?
Yeah, so that's correct. And he's like, massage. Okay, yeah, media is the massage. It still works. Mass age. Oh, that really works. So they just left it in. It was not deterministic.
Love it.
It was very much a accident. And then a lot of curation to discussion and conversation about whether to leave it in or take it out had to ensue, and then they decided to leave it in, which was pretty brave. If you think about being so academic, like I guess he was just smart enough to know that no one would assume he made a spelling mistake on the title of the page. But
I like the idea of media massaging the brains too, because it seems to have that ability.
Although it seems to be more like stompage.
Yeah. It's a very heavy masseuse hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
More like Rolfing. It Rolfs your brain, I suppose.
Rolfs your brain. I love that.
But it does lead to storytelling. Like they built a story behind that misspelling and suddenly sold it as a feature, not a defect. And you're like, is that could an LLM do that? Only realistically if it had been done before.
Well, the LLM can certainly make mistakes. That's been proven quite a bit, but I mean, I guess it's still up to us to say that's a good one, just like McLuhan did in that case.
Well,
and other people to enjoy the backstory of the title. Like it's suddenly like, that endears him. It endears the book. We're such nutcases for stories. We just love them.
Yeah. Well, it made me think of Seth Godin too. You were asking him if like generative AI could create purple cows. And I think what we settled on was that it could, but it would take a human to recognize it, right? Like generative AI might kick back the media as the massage, but it took a human to really like glom onto that and be like, no, wait, that is the thing. Like weirdly, that is the thing that will set this book apart.
Well, and actually just to get back to what I think Rob was saying a minute ago, just like the story behind the title there was endearing. And I think that is another aspect of a book's success, is that the author doesn't necessarily have to be endearing, but I was just going to say, and it's kind of a loaded way to put it, that the author has to be human, which is funny to say in this context, right?
Right.
But human in the sense of a reader can identify with them.
Yeah, relatable.
And could you identify with the non-human author?
I think in most cases, only under a deception, only under deceptive pretense, where could it effectively deceive you into thinking it's a human? Yes.
Yeah.
And therefore, it could fool you. But now you're talking about something that probably should be illegal, which is, deception of being a human. The problem with the positive use cases of that deception is that the negatives outweigh it. It's sort of like impersonating a police officer.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, it's like maybe there's a few use cases you could come up with where that's okay and that's a good thing, but the bad just far outweighs the good, and we should just
absolutely,
as a thing, kind of say that deception, impersonating a person, should just be illegal.
Well, and now we have this problem where, a lot of the main AI players are going to Washington and saying, regulate us.
Yeah.
And it's okay.
They're kind of saying, regulate us, I dare you.
But also,
I dare you to try.
Late. It's a little late because like the points we're making right now about things like impersonating a human, this is nothing that anyone hadn't thought of 10 or 20
exactly.
years ago.
It's illegal on the telephone already. Robocalls, like, this is done. We've done this.
Yeah.
We've been here.
Yeah, but now they want us to they want actually a really slow moving organization to come up with the law here. I mean, I don't know. It's disingenuous.
It's so it's loaded with, what do you do? It's the public is scared. Fear is dangerous. When you have a mass number of people that are experiencing fear, and they look to the government to parent them, calm them down, and the government doesn't know what to say. No.
Well, there's not a day I don't think about Stuart Brand's pace layer model. You guys might be familiar with. It's basically, if you envision, you can Google it, but if you envision an onion, like concentric rings, like an onion, what he talks about is in the core, there are things that are like never changing, like laws of physics, laws of nature. And as you move progressively out to the outside, you're talking about things that are more likely to change, like culture, and then like I think his most outer ring is fashion. And that model has been applied in a lot of other contexts to kind of bring home the fact or introduce the fact that in any domain or any context, there are things that are slow moving or non-moving and things that are not. And obviously the technology is an outer layer, right? It's constantly changing, and we need things that anchor society, anchor humanity, anchor the planet, if you will, to keep it safe, to maintain things while all this other stuff is changing on the outer layers. So I wonder if they're like, what in an AI environment like we're entering, what is the anchor? Is it government? Is it laws of nature? Is it something else? I don't know. I mean, but there needs to be some thought into what should be stabilizing rather than a knee-jerk, we're going to go to Washington and ask for regulation after the fact.
It's, and the optimist in me wants to say that, this idea of simulating a human being, which we're obviously very enamored with, what's great about it being in the space, what's great about it watching other people connect with it, is that it forces us to really be introspective and understand what a human being is, what they think, how they think, in a way that's not loaded, because we're trying to simulate it. So understanding it correctly matters. So we don't get to create fiction or make it what we want it to be, because it's not going to work. And that goes to all levels. Government's trying to understand it too, as we're understanding how to create humans, and how not just one human, but what most interests me is like groups of humans, right? These are social organisms that act as one, where each person is just a member of the larger singular organism, right? And how do groups behave? And how do groups of AIs, how should they behave? And by understanding all of this, and thinking about all of this, it starts to bring up all of the deficiencies in how we behave as humans, all the flaws and issues that we haven't dealt with. And so now we're sort of faced with dealing with some of these issues as human beings, that we should have dealt with probably along the way, and it's sort of just bringing it and surfacing it, and we're like, okay, we're saying, hey, it almost reminds me of those, like, I don't know anything about this, but the psychologists that use a puppet, for therapy. Like, well, now the puppet's AI, so now okay, that's effective. Like, talk to the puppet, tell the puppet how you feel, and we kind of start to reveal, like, by that puppet, and trying to make it, behave and respond in the right ways, that it needs to start understanding what we mean and what we feel, not what we say. And so this whole idea of like alignment is a great example. We study all the data and all the words in the world, and we create an algorithm that predicts the next word, except where it doesn't agree with where it doesn't agree with a large group of people, and then we have to align it, right? And we have to say, okay, this data, may represent a lot of the language used on the internet, but we don't want that language to be propagated. So we're going to edit that back. We're going to weight that down, and we're going to ultimately reveal more of the language that we want to be on the internet. So we're going to create our own reality inside this LLM. We're going to reshape the opinions of humanity to be more what we think it ought to be, which then lots and lots of conversations go about what should it be, what is truth, what is not truth, who gets to decide what the truth is. And these are now conversations we're all having. And it's about time, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. I think there's maybe the most fundamental question, which is kind of something we've been addressing in this conversation, but it's really everywhere now, whether we realize it or not, is what are humans good for?
Yeah.
What are humans good for? We never really had to ask that before. And, but we're all animated by it. We're all on our journey through life trying to figure out what we are as individuals are good for. And we're very unhappy when we don't have an answer to that question. And now we're being, confronted as a species with that, right? Like
and
we've never
you
really had to deal with that as a whole species.
Yeah, and I think you could say, though, maybe for most of evolution, we were fine. Maybe it's only recently that we're like so caught up on measuring ourselves by our productivity that we're suddenly having identity crisis, that some machine can dig faster than we can. Like we already knew that. We're just, now we have to face the fact that measuring who you are as a human being is maybe more about your relationships and connections and your creativity than it is about your productivity. And most of evolution, it was probably that way. On people's deathbed, it's almost, unanimously said that they don't track all of their productivity and say, that's what I'm most proud of in my life. It's usually the relationships or the creativity that happened. So if we're so caught up with productivity, what if this just forces us to reshape and go back to the way we should be measuring ourselves, which is the connectivity, the relationships we have, the creativity, the things we created and co-created in our lives. And that productivity is just a red herring that kind of introduced itself in the Industrial Revolution days and, the sort of, serfdom.
Well, I'm 100%. And it does kind of go back to capitalism and, they'll focus on productivity, and suddenly that's being eaten away at. Well, not suddenly, it's been happening for a while. And the big problem is we all have to eat.
Yeah. Although that's getting solved. That's getting solved. I mean, productivity, let's just imagine a world where productivity is abundant, which I think isn't hard to imagine because many of us live there today. Still, people are catching up, but, we're all moving in the right direction. And so if we look at, if we just imagine and let ourselves imagine a world where productivity is abundant, then what? Like, that existential crisis, we should all face that. We should go, okay, so let's imagine that we have more than we can eat. What should we do with our time? Run marathons? Check, doing that. Paint? Yep, check.
I don't know. I mean, I'm with you to a degree, and I hope we get to that point, but I would also argue that point where there's so much productivity, there's so much wealth, we're there. It's just not distributed.
Inequitable, exactly, yeah.
And I don't know that the hoarding by individuals or small groups with fingers on the levers of policy, if that goes away, even if the world has 10 times more wealth to spread around than it does today.
Yeah, I think equity is the key, right? And it's tough because you're looking at, machines taking up productivity, and being our productive agents, and now that affecting, like worsening that inequity potentially. And I think there's a lot to look at. It's hard to really say how that nets out in the short term, in the long term, in the medium term. It's going to be very different. I think when I look at somebody whose day is prioritized around productivity, like clearly how much, how many shovels of dirt did you dig? How many, strawberries did you pick? And you let them live more of a creativity-based life. I think they're going to be happier individuals. For those of us already fortunate enough to live a life that's more based on creativity and connectivity, we're going to have a different perspective on the threat. We're going to worry for those people, right? On one hand, the best of us, I guess, will, and they worry for themselves. But there certainly is an adjustment that says, but will their lives be better once they get to live the lives some of us live, right? Which is less productivity measured.
And what kind of systemic change needs to happen to get to that point? And is capitalism going to get in the way of that? Seems likely.
Probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not quite as optimistic maybe as Rob is. I'd like to be. The optimism that I feel that AI is going to bring us is maybe it's going to simplify things that are frustratingly complex. Like, will AI maybe help me file my tax return? That wouldn't be such a bad thing. Will AI help me get my medical bills paid in a fair way where I know for sure I'm not getting gouged? Or will AI help me get a mortgage? Maybe these aren't great examples, but I do think the lives we live are really weighed down by the complexity that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And that kind of excites me, because I don't think the complexity's gone away. We're not going to simplify the tax code anytime soon. We're not going to make it easier to wade through the Department of Motor Vehicles to renew your license, but maybe AI can help in some of those contexts.
Yeah. I think
it's
systemically
in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. I would agree with that. I'd say that, tax laws were designed for humans, right? And much of it is to influence human behavior, right? To buy homes, or, to kind of, it wouldn't be as complicated if human behavior wasn't a component. It could be simplified, but it's designed to modify human behavior. And so, the government as a whole, us as a whole, will have to find alternative ways to influence people in the directions we want them to. If AI suddenly acts as an intermediary and a GPS to filing your taxes, where you don't know where you're going anymore, you don't know how to get there, you just let the AI handle it for you. It kind of removes a tool on how to incentivize certain behaviors in certain ways, and they'll have to find other tools to say, how do we encourage homeownership or entrepreneurship, or all the things that are ultimately designed to influence our behavior through the tax law. But on the other hand, to your point, it gets so complicated it's not influencing us because we didn't even know their tax benefits anymore. It's like that point where now it's gotten so complicated. So maybe it just helps us learn more. We were on a podcast with Lee Hood, and we talked about having kind of a concierge for your health, and managing your health care. And we said, we're more likely interested in not just one but two or more that would argue in front of us. Should I eat this donut? And they have a fight, and they kind of throw data points back and forth. And well, if he eats the donut, then he's got to run, or walk 20 minutes. And his, well, yeah, but I mean, a good walk would be nice today. The weather's good, and then we ultimately make the decision, right? So now we feel empowered. And Lee's point was, and we're educated. Like, we just learned something through this entertaining, conflict that happened between two AIs arguing about whether we should eat a donut or not. I think that's. So could it argue about whether we should buy a house or not, and should we start our own company or not? Like, yeah,
right.
I think that's a better view of it than nanny AI, where it's just taking care of my taxes for me, and now I'm just oblivious to tax law or the consequences of what I do, because I'm just, it's that GPS. I get lost. GPS battery dies. I don't know where I am because I haven't been paying attention.
Well, the AI agents arguing with each other. They're just they're coming up with straw men. And, in this case, you're just comparing the two straw men. But that's really, really valuable. And I'll just go back to not IA as the solution to everything, but IA that is ever present. Any kind of straw man is, an argument is ultimately sits on top of a framework. Frames out some aspect of a domain. And to do that consciously, I think you need, some sense-making ability to develop some kind of ontology of that domain. And whether you use IA or you use something else, that's what's happening. And that kind of brings us full circle to where we started today.
Yeah, exactly. Is it IA? Is it prompt engineering? Is it context generators? Context architects?
Well, it feels like there's an intersection, too, between moment prisons and storytelling, because I feel like moment prisons do represent an aspect of storytelling. You're telling yourself a story about how your skill sets fit in with other people's skill sets and this important work that's being done. And now I get to be a part of this forever. And then, I think, Lou, you said you have a teenager in the house. I've watched a lot of the Marvel movies with my sons, and it's like those movies. The whole empire started out really strong. It was all these very compelling stories, and each new movie was so exciting. And then they did kind of reach a point where it's like they're hitting the same notes, and it doesn't feel fresh anymore. And the storytelling is now becoming less apparent. It's more just about like cataloging who's showing up at all these different movies, and we're losing that aspect. And I wonder if that is like sort of a similar trajectory to the moment prison.
I'm not sure. I mean, that's an entertainment. Obviously, it's a world they've constructed, and maybe you're right. Whereas the stories that introduce that world are sort of spent. And now, if I understand it, I'm not a big Marvel movie watcher, but I think what you're saying is what becomes the story is not here's a world, but here's like interesting new combinations of people and trends in that world,
and
maybe
arguments about what's canon.
World building.
Yeah.
right. But there's definitely like, I'm sure there's some urge for people who are big fans to pin things down long enough that they can understand it, and that can smother the storytelling because moving forward, because it may smother the evolution of that world. And maybe you're right. So maybe in that regard, it is a moment prison. It is a smothering of change.
Yeah. Well, your cat's meowing, Josh. That usually means it's time to wrap it up.
Oh yeah, my cat has announced himself here.
Yes,
the podcast.
Oh, my cat's ignoring me, but I'll go with what your cat has to say here.
This was great conversation. Really good.
Loved it. Thank you.
We just kind
of really fun.
Delved all over the place. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, thanks
Well,
again.
when you
enjoyed
guys
having
said
you on.
we want to talk about AI, I don't really know anything about AI, so I'm glad to try to keep up with you for an hour and a half. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great.
It's been amazing. Thanks, Lou. Hey, thanks again for tuning in to Invisible Machines. Don't forget to follow Invisible Machines wherever you get your podcasts so that you can hear new episodes as soon as they drop. You can also watch this podcast on the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. Thank you so much to everyone who listens to this podcast, and especially to those of you who leave comments, because we've received a lot of really useful commentary that has helped us shape this podcast as we move forward with it. Thank you, as always, to our producers, Elias Parker, Kate Timchenko, and our video editor, Michael Litvinov, for making this podcast look and sound wonderful. We look forward to catching up with you again next week, right here on Invisible Machines.